All right. And one of the key topics in the water unit is dams. Um, College Board always talks about dams, big global thing. America's a world leader in dams. Now we're over it. The rest of the world is getting onto it, but we've moved on. We're going to build dams. We're going to talk about their impact. And then at the end, there's some slides that have a bunch of information that you'll probably want in writing. And the problem is I only have about 15 minutes to do what used to be a 1-hour lecture. So I'm going to do my best. Remember that a dam is a way to block a river, and rivers flow through canyons. The dam will stop the river to build a reservoir. And then if you can control the water leaving, you now have a reliable water supply. And by the way, you can get some electricity out of this. Hoover Dam was America's biggest and most famous dam. It proved to the world that this was possible. Imagine being the nut job that had this idea and everybody says you can't do it. And America's like, oh, I don't know, man. It's the Great Depression. Let's give it a shot. And they give it a shot and it worked. Holy mackerel. So Hoover Dam was the first. It proved the concept. And then we went crazy. We built a whole bunch, hundreds all around the United States. You can see in this diagram, I'll do my best to highlight this. Frustrated now. Okay, I hope you can see this on your screen. Here goes the river. That's the corrugated stuff. That's the river. This edge is the canyon floor. And by adding a dam, the water rises to make the reservoir. And of course, look at my hands, please. If the canyon floor is narrow, it's wider at the top. So you get to fill in a reservoir that's pretty big at the surface, right? So that's this line here, the light blue at the surface. Okay. I also want you to notice these. I've highlighted them in red for you. These are called diversion tunnels. Oh, it doesn't line up anymore. Sorry. These are called diversion tunnels. And we're going to talk about those, but you'll notice that they go through the canyon wall. You're looking at the reservoir from above. So we're going to talk about that. If you're going to build a dam, you start with tunnels. Those tunnels look like this. They're really, really big. And if you were the water flooding at me and I'm trying to do a construction project in front of us, I got to move that water out of the way. So I want to shoot it through the canyon walls and have that move around me. See, those tunnels go first. You build these tubes that carry the river inside the canyon walls like this, so that then you can make a dry spot at the bottom of the canyon. So I'm hoping I can make this visible. I hope you can see this red line. Here's the bottom of the canyon, and you'll notice it's pretty dry because the river was pushed into the canyon, flowed through the canyon wall, and came in here. These are the tunnels taking the water in. Okay, so you have these tunnels built, you drop some dirt into the canyon floor, and now that you've got dirt in the canyon floor, that's going to push the water into the tunnels. That builds a dry spot. You stack some dirt, add some concrete, put a little bit of plumbing in there, and voila, you've got some overflow towers so that the water can go through the turbines. Here you have turbines inside, and presto, no big deal. Largest building project in the history of humanity. There was 8-hour shifts around the clock, 24/7 for about 3.5 years. You may know that your mommy and daddy take more than 3.5 years to build a deck in the yard sometimes, but this was the Great Depression. So we had about one worker dying per day. And there was just a labor line where people would be like, oh, lost another one. Okay, you can come in. And we would just flood America's much depressed workforce through this project. It took just a little while. We could let the water out when we wanted it. This is another dam. Let the water out when you want it, and it spins the turbines and generates electricity. I wish we had more time to talk about this, but the history of the Colorado River is one of the things we're going to have to cut this year. You can see that the Colorado River has about 11 reservoirs today. And the thing that is more relevant perhaps this year is the fact that rivers are normally wild. They have seasons. There's a time in the year when it's dry because it's not raining, so the river tends to be low, but that's when everybody needs water, when it's not raining. Then there's a time when a river is wet. There's a bunch of water. It's flooding. The river has a whole bunch, but that's when nobody needs water, right? Because it just rained. So you don't need somebody else's water because the rain just watered the lawn. So the funny thing is that rivers have a rhythm, but the whole point is the natural rhythm isn't good enough. I need water when it's not raining. So dams are built precisely to prevent the natural rhythm of a river. Dams are made to give you the opposite cycle of what is natural. So this shouldn't look like this. Dams make 3 different types of changes. So I'm going to go really fast in my lecture, but you're going to need some time to write these notes, okay? I want to talk about physical, ecological, and human changes that are caused by a river uphill of the dam and downhill of the dam, okay? So some physical changes to a river. Above the dam, you've now flooded a canyon, right? Because you're putting water in the canyon. You should know that water evaporates. Some dams lose as much as half their water volume to evaporation because it's sitting still and it's up high, right? So it's got more wind and more sunlight. It's not in the bottom of the canyon anymore. It's up at the top. So evaporation is a really big whoop. Some rivers lose as much as half their water content to evaporation in the reservoir. And because the water's being slowed down, that sediment is building up in the reservoir. These are all the changes that happen uphill from the dam. Then below the dam, the water's saltier now, right? Because you evaporate some water, but the salt is left behind. So you salinate the water. The water gets clear because you've left the sediment, and the water gets cold because by making the water deep, the sunlight only hits the top. And you know this, you jump to the bottom of the pool and you try to go along the bottom, and that's colder water at the bottom. And that's where the water leaves, from the bottom. So downhill of the dam, the water is more clear, lost the sediment, and it's more cold because the bottom of the reservoir. Of course, downhill from the dam, there is now a decrease in sediment transport. Rivers are a place where sediment lives for a while. And because reservoirs hold all the sediment, there's really no more sediment in the river downhill of the dam. Ecologically, this is really big. Uphill, you have fragmented habitat, right? Because now the river has this huge pool of cold water. And uphill, you've now got a giant migration barrier. You can probably skip across streams and rivers here and there, but it's very difficult to get across a dam that's 3 miles wide. Like rabbits are becoming different species on either side of reservoirs because they can't interbreed anymore. That's a real study, by the way, in Colorado. Downhill of a reservoir, some really big changes happen. Fish can't hide anymore. Like fish evolved to be brown from muddy rivers, but now they're brown in a clear river. So that's affecting fish species. They no longer hide because the water's too clear. That mud bottom affects things that feed or breed at the bottom. So a lot of insect species can no longer lay their babies because there's no more sediment at the bottom of the river. Downhill, the temperature changes are important, and some species, frankly, die because the water's too cold now. Without the sediment supply, you've lost a lot of riparian habitat, so vegetation can no longer grow along the river. And because the water is now saltier, you evaporate water out, so the remaining water has the same amount of salt in a smaller volume. So the water is now saltier, right? So the salinization of water downhill of the dam affects plants and amphibians and fish. Finally, there's human impacts. For one thing, people lose their land. In the US, I got to pay you if I'm going to build a dam. But in many parts of the world, they didn't even get a warning. It's just the river starts to flood and all of a sudden you've lost your house. The loss of land can be a big whoop. And even in the US, if you've got grandpa buried out on the farm and the state says, here's a couple bucks, we're going to make your farm into a reservoir, that might still suck and you don't get a choice sometimes. So the loss of land is a really touchy, sensitive issue for people uphill of dams. Also, when you flood a reservoir, you bury archaeology. And American reservoirs have thousands of archaeological sites underwater. As a matter of fact, because we were the first country to build big dams, and because we have a lot of archaeological history along the Colorado River, you can imagine a lot of American Indians lived along that river in the past, right? We became the world's leader in underwater archaeology. Fun detail. It's also important to point out that dams don't last very long, so they're a stupid investment. Now, downhill of the dam, there's a lot of impacts on people. For one thing, sediment supply helps counter erosion at the coast, but when you block the sediment and coastlines are eroding, this is complicated, so I have to just kind of say it quickly and move on. Our coastlines are sinking because they don't get resupply from sediment anymore. That's called coastal subsidence, sinking subsidence. It's written on your screen. Number two, farmers often rely on that sediment to resupply farms because people like to farm on floodplains. Dams really affect our fisheries, especially salmon, but a few other ocean fisheries. And dams have created horrible international conflict, like wars fought over who's got the water. And you can imagine if Mexico was more angry that we were keeping their water, they might pick a fight over that. We've had a lot of international issues globally centered on one country damming the water that another country needs. Anyway, that was really rushed. I hope you got a chance to write that down. You could also ask me in class. I'll see you soon.